And now Jim O'Hagan joins me with a story which also takes us back to wartime days in Italy.
Hello again, Walter. One cool March morning, around 8 o'clock in 1944, a sleek black car drove up to St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and stopped some distance from the church at a well-demarcated white line, which was the frontier of the neutral Vatican city-state and the rest of Rome. The occupants of the car got out. One was Colonel Kappler, head of the Gestapo in Rome at the time. The others were two of his subordinates in plain clothes. They surveyed the scene, and in particular a dark, rather sinister-looking figure in priestly attire, standing well back on the top step of the basilica. Kappler gave his men orders to kidnap that mad Irish priest, as he called the figure. The kidnap was to be carried out the next day, but the priest's associates got wind of the plan and it was thwarted. Walter, the mad priest, as Kappler dubbed him, was Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty from County Kerry, and his exploits in the Eternal City during the years of the Second World War constitute some of the most daring and exciting events of that war. Hugh Joseph O'Flaherty was born on the 28th of February 1898 in Killarney, the son of a sergeant in the Royal Irish Constabulary. He grew up to be a tall, well-built man of 6'2", a good athlete, a boxer, hurler, scratch golfer and handballer. O'Flaherty initially trained as a national school teacher, but failed his finals in 1918 due to illness. Having a strong inclination for the priesthood as well, he then attended Mungret College in Limerick, and after some years in Rome studying theology, he was ordained there in 1925 and attached to the Propaganda College in that city. In the late 20s and in the 30s, becoming a Monsignor, he travelled extensively in the service of the Church to Egypt and Haiti. Finally, in 1938, he joined the Holy Office. The Holy Office, which today is called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, is the Catholic Church's internal Supreme Court of Justice and is concerned with matters of orthodoxy and discipline. O'Flaherty, in addition to his duties there, became a sort of church ambassador and unofficial diplomat, and thus came into contact with many people of importance in the Rome of the period. When war broke out in 1939, the new Pope Pius XII, and with Italy soon on the side of Germany, established an organisation to gather news about prisoners of war, refugees and the unaccountable multitude of displaced people which the war had created. As the Holy Office could not now carry out many of its normal functions, O'Flaherty was assigned to this work in a leading capacity and took to it with relish. He toured prisoner of war camps containing Allied troops all over Italy. In this capacity, he brought back messages from the camps to loved ones in faraway lands, and it is said personally distributed 10,000 books to prisoners of war and much clothing. This state of affairs continued more or less until the end of 1942, when the Monsignor was relieved of these duties, being a thorn in the flesh of some camp authorities. Due to the Vatican's neutrality, a number of Allied representatives accredited to the Holy See, including the British minister, were brought into the Vatican and carried out their functions there. Many Allied POWs who had escaped from camps all over Italy made their way to St. Peter's in Rome and attempted to claim ecclesiastical sanctuary in the Basilica. The Swiss Guards, the papal guardians, who can still be seen today in their distinctive uniforms by visitors to the Vatican, at the time turned a blind eye to a lot of these POWs, and many were admitted. But higher Vatican officials became alarmed and demanded the practice to be discontinued. It was while seeing 14 British prisoners of war being turned away one day in mid-1943 that Monsignor O'Flaherty determined to do something unofficially to help them. He always had the conviction, Walter, that people, when looking for things, seldom look under their own noses. Accordingly, he had this group put up temporarily in an Italian police barracks, where he was friendly with one of the policemen. His audacity knew no bounds, as we shall see as the story goes on. The British POWs stayed there until just after the Italian surrender in early September 43, when the city began to be flooded with Germans who set up a military government, and the reign of the Gestapo, who were the German secret police, started. O'Flaherty went to see the British minister, Sir Darcy Osborne, who, in his urbane way, explained that there wasn't much he could do officially about hiding groups such as the one I have already spoken of, but offered help from his own pocket. He was a wealthy man, an aristocrat, a bachelor, and heir presumptive to the Duke of Leeds. He introduced the Monsignor to his butler, John May, and told him to work through May. O'Flaherty later described May, who was a small man and a cockney, as, and I quote, a genius, indispensable, and the most magnificent scrounger I have ever come across. In time, a great bond of respect and affection was made between the two of them. It was said that if O'Flaherty knew everyone of importance in Rome, May knew everyone else. People who worked with the pair of them at the time said that May was near to being a miracle worker. He knew the black market inside out, and whether one required clothing, boots, razor blades or cigarettes, he could obtain them. Another vital helper was Mrs. Henrietta Chevalier. Mrs. Chevalier was the widow of a Maltese man and had 6 daughters and 2 sons. From this time until the end of the war, she performed a most heroic role in billeting escaped POWs in her small flat in Rome and offering them family life, thus risking death if exposed as a collaborator with the Allies. The Germans had warned anyone so caught of this fate. O'Flaherty and May were initially the linchpins of the organisation, but very soon a third person was added. This was Count Sarsfield Salazar, who had many influential contacts with people who were to provide many and other numerous billets for the escapees. One man, Prince Filippo Pamphili, a member of an old Roman family and an avowed anti-fascist, provided much financially to the new unofficial organisation. Monsignor O'Flaherty, who at the beginning of the war had by no means been pro-British, it must be said, had by now, in late 1943, become quite anti-Nazi. The Gestapo treatment of the Jews in Rome had convinced him of the evil nature of the occupying regime. By now his clandestine activities had become known to all of the Allied authorities, and Colonel Kappler and Ludwig Koch, an Austrian who was head of the Roman fascists. Indeed, Koch was to state that if the Monsignor was taken prisoner, he would personally remove the priest's fingernails before shooting him. The enemies of O'Flaherty kept trying to catch him as he moved about between the billets of the escapees, bringing money, cigarettes and home comforts. He apparently knew no fear, and today is remembered as the Scarlet Pimpernel. were not on the move, and after his priestly duties were attended to, he stood on the steps of St. Peter's, looking out at night and in the early morning for those needing his help. There were a number of times that O'Flaherty used priestly garb to disguise prisoners seeking sanctuary. One such was Colin Leslie, a lieutenant in the Irish Guards. Leslie had escaped and was hiding unofficially in the British Embassy in Rome. But one of the Monsignor's men at the embassy worried that he might be unearthed, so O'Flaherty duly turned up one night and said to Leslie, "Right, my boy, try these on. You haven't much time." Everyone, Walter, to O'Flaherty was "my boy." Leslie was given the garments of a Monsignor, which included the Monsignor's own black golf trousers. When kitted out, they left and duly proceeded to enter the Vatican, past the unsuspecting papal guards, having, it appeared, something of a staged argument between them to allay suspicion. Some years later, O'Flaherty wrote to Leslie and asked for the trousers back. Leslie's wife sent him a new pair. One of the interesting aspects of this period in Rome is that the Germans never placed any sort of guard on the British embassy. Strange, isn't it? Sometimes, too, escaped POWs hid in the country around the capital and entered the city on farm carts. Apparently it was better to sit up beside the friendly driver of the horse, for the produce on the cart was more suspected of hiding a fugitive. Some of these POWs would have been using false identity documents obtained for them by the Monsignor's organisation. One funny incident concerned a Lieutenant Wilson of the Royal Artillery, who attempted to gain sanctuary in St. Peter's without knowing O'Flaherty. In the process, his attempt failed, and he was unceremoniously removed by two burly papal guards. Luckily, he was not spotted by the German guards, who always ringed their side of occupied Rome, behind the White Line in the piazza of the Basilica. Later, with O'Flaherty's help, Wilson did gain sanctuary, and then gave the Monsignor a letter of complaint, which he asked to be passed on to the Pope, about how the papal guards had treated him. O'Flaherty passed the complaint upwards, and in due course the lieutenant got a bland reply, noting his comments and saying he'd be very welcome to return and look around the church at a more convenient time. Perhaps the nearest escape the Monsignor had from his enemies' clutches was the time in Pamphili's office in Rome, when he was collecting money for the organisation's day-to-day needs. An associate, upon looking out of a window, noticed that the SS had ringed the building. They had obviously been tipped off about O'Flaherty's presence. O'Flaherty took the money and left. He descended into the cellars of the building and noticed at one end an open trapdoor where coal men were delivering coal through. He gingerly edged his way up and looked to the surface, where he saw two men preparing the further unloading of the coal. He pulled an empty sack, which was lying on the ground, towards him, got back down the trapdoor, took off his Monsignor's collar and soutane and coat, and stuffed them into the empty bag. After dousing himself with coal dust, he climbed back up and quietly motioned one of the Italian coalmen to him and explained who he was. All this was going on behind the backs of the SS troops. The Italian agreed to help him, many of them by now being no lovers of the Germans. And so, borrowing his cap, O'Flaherty alighted the trapdoor, took a bag of coal from the lorry and marched out through the gate with the bag on his back. The SS, so intent in watching the main building, took no notice of him going out the gate with the coal. The Monsignor's audacity had paid off yet again. He carried the bag a short distance, dumped it, and proceeded in a filthy state from the dust of the coal to a nearby church sacristy. The startled sacristan allowed him a wash up there and loaned him a clean soutane and overcoat, in which he returned to the Vatican. One day a Jewish man came to the Monsignor on the steps of St. Peter's and asked him to take care of his young son, as he had heard he and his wife were to be deported. He gave the Monsignor a very expensive gold chain in payment. O'Flaherty told him that there would be no payment involved, that the boy would be taken to a safe haven, and that the man and his wife would be given forged Italian papers, which meant that they wouldn't be touched. He took the gold chain and said he would mind it for the family. O'Flaherty tossed the chain into his work desk and forgot about it. Sure enough, at the end of the war, when the Jewish family were reunited, the gold chain was returned to them unharmed. In the autumn of 1943, the Germans made it known that the Jewish families in Rome were going to be rounded up, unless a ransom of the equivalent of £2 million sterling was paid. The money was paid by the aristocratic families of the city. Pius XII contributed £100 weight in gold by melting down sacred church vessels. Afterwards, the chief rabbi of Rome, Dr. Zolli, so impressed was he by this gesture that he converted to the Catholic faith. Needless to say, the occupying power did not keep to his word, and the Jews were persecuted. Very late in 1943, and after much bullish persuasion by O'Flaherty, the British minister, Sir Darcy Osborne, made some official funds available to the escape organisation, and the man selected, after much careful scrutiny, to work alongside the Monsignor and coordinate it was Major Sam Derry. Darcy Osborne was able to obtain official government funds, it is said, by emphasising the opportunities for espionage activities, which could and were subsequently carried on by some escaped POWs. Sam Derry was an escapee born in Nottinghamshire in 1914, who became the fourth person at the top of the clandestine organisation. In time he brought a much-needed sense of discipline to the men it was looking after, nearly 4,000 of them, from many different countries and many different locations in the city. Of course, from time to time they were allowed out, and sometimes outrageously mixed with their German and Italian fascist overlords. The story is told how one evening in 1944, O'Flaherty obtained tickets for some of the escapees to attend a performance of The Barber of Seville, the opera by Rossini. In the course of the evening, using flattery, a lady friend of one of them obtained the autograph of the German governor of the city, who happened to be sitting close at hand. With his signature, the organisation was later able to forge many valuable documents for use on a day-by-day basis. This was a feature, Walter, of the sort of thing that went on, with German officers sometimes sitting at concerts or in bars, cheek by jowl, with escaped Allied prisoners of war, if only they had known. The Irish minister to the Vatican in those times was Dr. Thomas Kiernan, who did operate a strictly neutral policy towards Germans and Allies alike. But his wife, the renowned ballad singer Delia Murphy, and her daughter Blonde were friendly towards the aims of the organisation and knew O'Flaherty well. Listeners may remember Delia Murphy as a singer, especially of the old song The Spinning Wheel. In the summer of 1944, many of the billeted men were running short of footwear, and John May found out that adjacent to the building which housed the Irish legation was a boot repair factory for German troops and army personnel. From that time on until the end of the hostilities, the O'Flaherty organisation was never short of suitable footwear for the ex-POWs. How this occurred is a matter of speculation, but it was a useful piece of information gleaned by May and accordingly acted upon. May also used the British diplomatic bag out of Darcy Osborne's legation to the Foreign Office in London, and this proved extremely beneficial to the escapees organisation as well. It was often remarked on at the time, did such an astute person as Pius XII actually know of O'Flaherty's activities? Or were the higher ranks of the Papal Guard aware of them? My guess is that the Pope did know, but did not want to be involved officially. After all, he could hardly have missed the nightly and early morning spectacle of the Scarlet Pimpernel on his vigil on the Basilica steps. The papal apartments overlooked the square and steps. As far as the guards were concerned, O'Flaherty and May had enough contacts inside that organisation to ensure loyalty. It is a fact, though, that on at least one occasion the Monsignor was warned officially by his religious superiors to confine his activities to his religious duties. Mrs. Chevalier's apartment had a number of hair-raising incidents too. One such involved a raid one evening by the SS. The soldiers billeted there had barely time to escape onto the balcony at the back, where a friendly neighbour on the floor above had lowered a ladder to enable them to shelter in his flat. As 1944 progressed, the Allies came nearer and nearer to Rome, and it was during this time that the Germans were particularly unrelenting in their attempts to catch members of the organisation. Finally, the city was liberated, but this brought new problems for the Monsignor, as the hue and cry went up now, and a lot of Italians clamoured for vengeance. Ironically, the fascist Koch sent an intermediary to O'Flaherty seeking safe passage for his family out of Rome, as he knew he was in danger of being rounded up. O'Flaherty arranged this and did a lot to stem off the tide of hatred which now swept the city against its former oppressors. At the war's end, the Allied Screening Commission was set up to compensate those that were owed money, and approximately £1 million was paid to those individuals who had helped the Allied cause, including many in O'Flaherty's organisation. The Monsignor played a leading role in aiding the commission. In 1946, Hugh O'Flaherty received the CBE, Sam Derry received the DSO, and many in the organisation were honoured in one way or another. Recognised for their contributions were a number of priests, and Miss Molly Stanley, John May and Mrs. Chevalier, who received the British Empire Medal. After the war, the Monsignor returned to his normal Vatican duties, and an additional one when he became a sort of unofficial parish priest to a very poor district of Rome, in which he worked all of his spare time for the next 12 years, rebuilding their church, providing schools and doing social work, as well as the normal religious duties. During this period too, from the late 1940s and throughout the 50s, he repeatedly resisted offers to record his memoirs to newspaper, TV and film people. He did reluctantly talk about himself to one journalist, John P. Gallagher, who later christened him the Scarlet Pimpernel of the Vatican, and wrote a highly readable and vivid book about his exploits, which was 9 years in preparation. It came out in 1967 and was published by the Souvenir Press of London. It was later republished in 1983 as The Scarlet and the Black by Font Paperbacks. A thrilling film of the same name was made, which starred Gregory Peck, Christopher Plummer and John Gielgud. Monsignor O'Flaherty's health began to fail in the 1950s, and in 1960 he suffered a stroke and retired from Vatican service. Ironically, during these post-war years, he was one of the few to visit regularly in prison Colonel Kappler, who had been given life imprisonment for war crimes. O'Flaherty tried also to have his sentence reduced. Interestingly, Kappler converted to the Catholic faith. After a spell working as a priest in Los Angeles, the Monsignor returned for good to County Kerry early in 1963. In February of that year, he took part with Eamon Andrews in a This Is Your Life programme about Sam Derry. He suffered a second stroke in May, and in October of 1963 died at the house of his sister in Cahir Savine at the age of 65. He is buried in the local cemetery there. There is a lovely but apocryphal story of Pope John the 23rd in the late 1950s wanting to make him a bishop and saying to him, tongue-in-cheek, "Now you can go off to Africa and do some real work." O'Flaherty had his critics, some of whom saw him as a publicity seeker. Others questioned many larger-than-life stories about his exploits, which were simply untrue and not put about by himself, for he was a genuinely modest and sometimes naive person, being shocked one day to hear himself being described as a true saint. John P. Gallagher maintains that still others were jealous of what he had truly achieved. To my mind, and in the minds of many, Hugh O'Flaherty was motivated chiefly by the plain Christian message of love thy neighbour as thyself, a precept he endeavoured to carry out all the days of his life.
Jim O'Hagan. And coming up in the second half of the programme today, Alf McCreary's journey around Northern Ireland, the subject of his latest book, and Roy Irvine with some of the great American dance bands. But taking us to the news at 4 o'clock, the New London Orchestra with Albert Ketelby's Bells Across the Meadow.